this is CIVE633 Environmental Hydrology, and today is November 9th, 2021. And the subject today is salinity. We have a holiday on Thursday, so I'm going to have to cover most, or if not all, most of the material just today. So there's going to be a lot of material covered. Let me move on to share the screen. I'm going to share the screen in here. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see the screen? It's a blue, dark blue screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, cool. So interestingly though, many of these papers have been put into video, so you can reinforce your knowledge with the video. Many of them, because we've been active for the last few years, 4 or 5 years doing this. So the first paper that I'm going to cover is a fact-finding paper. What is salinity? It's a much misunderstood subject. Not people don't spend a lot of time talking about salinity. They talk about contaminants. They talk about vegetation and so forth in terms of the environment, but not salinity. And like I said earlier, this was my first subject as I started my engineering career a little more than 50 years ago. So we eventually put it together, and I'm going to narrate or describe for you 13 facts that we put together we believe are important in understanding the issues of river basin salinity. At the end of next week, I am going to touch base on a paper written by um, a very reputable American engineer whose name at this point I don't remember, but I'll get to it. And he basically wraps it all up. And of course, all the stuff that we're narrating here was learned through reading and study of the many papers written on this subject. The first fact is rivers always carry a certain amount of dissolved solids, among them salt ions. There is no such a thing as pure water flowing on the surface of the earth. And the reason is because it's flowing on soil, usually. And the soil has all kinds of stuff out there attached to it in the process of decomposition or disaggregation and so forth. So water has the capability to pick up stuff. We know that already. So it's going to pick up. So it follows from that notion that the rivers upstream are going to be somewhat clean and the downstream rivers are going to be somewhat dirty. And if we study the gradient of concentration of salts, we will see that that is in fact the case. Of course, that would depend on the local and regional climate, because the drier, or rather the drier the weather, the more salts would appear in the river, because the salts are being picked up. While if you go through the Amazon doesn't have any more salts left, no nutrients and so forth, and there's not going to be a whole lot of salt pickup in regions that are very wet. Okay, amount of total dissolved solids varies widely from less than 100 ppm for headwater streams in humid regions, like I think I already mentioned earlier or before, that Lake Superior in northern US, central US, and Canada has been reported that has 60 ppm, which is considered to be extremely clean, while the Colorado River can get to about 800. And why is the Colorado River not clean, or I guess you could say filled with salts? Because the background noise is about 2 to 300. So the Colorado rivers are 2 to 3 times saltier than normal. And that is because the Colorado River is coming from a region which used to be endorheic. And since it was endorheic, it collected sand, salts. And then afterwards, when the Colorado Canyon broke through Arizona in order to get over to the Pacific, it had to start releasing the salts that were out there collected for millions of years. Number two, dissolved solids originate in the parent rocks. Exactly. The rocks have about 2%, And that, I believe, has been documented. I'll come back to repeat that later on. About 2% of the weight is salts, all kinds of salts, some good salts, some bad salts, but they're all salts. I don't know, I'm not going to mention how many, but there's a lot of salts out there.
Professor Ponce.
Yes?
I just wanted to let you know I was here. I don't know if you took attendance. It's Axel.
Who's this?
Axel Linder.
Okay, yeah, fine. I got you here, Axel. Thank you for telling me. Yeah, you got in a little bit late. You're fine. You're fine. Okay, so the fact number 2, originating the parent rock. We know. Fact number 3, several types of dissolved salt cations, positive, and anions, negative, enter the hydrosphere through runoff. Right, runoff picks up the salts. The salt cations are sodium, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And the anions are chloride, the typical anions. There are other, but they're not typical. The anions are chloride, sulfate, and carbonate. Potassium and magnesium are mostly used by the biosphere, while sodium and calcium are not. This is a very important concept. The amount of salts generated are about the same, but the potassium and magnesium don't show up in the water because they're being used by the biosphere. Almost 90 to 100%. We know that for a fact based on the data that is available. But sodium and calcium, they're used, but they're not used too much. Both of them are wasted. But eventually, calcium is used. We already know that. In the ocean, calcium is used in the production of shells. So sodium is the only salt that that it does not have a specific use in the quantities in which it appears. That is why it collects. Fact number 5, evaporation and evapotranspiration leave the waste salt behind, concentrating them in the remaining water bodies. So there's evaporation. Anytime any water evaporates, the water is going up, evaporating into the sky, and the salts are being left behind. Any evaporation process will leave salts behind. That is why rivers, as they move downstream, have a tendency to get saltier because the water is evaporating. You cannot avoid the evaporation of water. As a matter of fact, if we hold water in reservoirs, the reservoirs will evaporate water too. We, of course, hold a lot more water because then it evaporates. Otherwise, we will hold water in a reservoir and it evaporates. The next day or the next month, we go in there, there's no water. It evaporated. Evaporation, of course, depends on the amount of evaporation. We know that we have calculated that in hydrology. Depends on the temperature, the vapor pressure, and so forth. Number 6, headwater streams have a smaller concentration of dissolved solids. I already explained that why. Number 7, irrigation. Irrigation is a consumptive use of water, produces additional evapotranspiration, increasing the concentration of total dissolved solids in runoff waters. So irrigation is good and bad. It's good because it produces stuff that we can eat. It's bad because it produces additional evapotranspiration. So any amount of irrigation will produce an extra amount of salts. There's no question about that. We have been irrigating for more than 100 years now here in California at the beginning of the 20th century, so 120 years. Prior to that, there was very little irrigation. Irrigation was necessary in order to support the settlement of the Western United States. And that is why President Roosevelt in the year 1903 created the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Reclaiming Western lands for productivity, meaning irrigation. Irrigation was the first job that the Bureau of Reclamation had to do. Like everything else, like Machiavelli said, there's nothing good coming out of something bad. I mean, there's always, if you have something positive, there's always some side effects, some negativity involved with it. Fact number 8, storage reservoirs produce additional evapotranspiration, increasing the concentration of total dissolved solids and therefore in the hydrosphere. Fact number 9, rivers of developed basins have higher concentration of TDS than rivers of pristine basins. We have an example here of the San Joaquin. The San Joaquin River near Vernalis, California, is one of the most highly developed rivers and basins in the United States because it covers half of the Central Valley, south of San Francisco Bay. The northern part is covered by the Sacramento River, but the Sacramento River comes from the north, and the San Joaquin comes from the south. And what's the difference? The difference is in the latitude, because the northern latitudes are wetter because of hydrology, of weather. They over millennia they have drained the salts, so the Sacramento is not as salty or not likely to produce as much salt as the San Joaquin. This is a photo of the San Joaquin River near Vernalis, California. The San Joaquin is very salty because there's a lot of development in the valley. Again, I repeat, there's development north and development south, but the development in the south creates more salts because it's drier. Evaporation ponds take the extra salts away from the runoff and deposit them in the soils. This is an example of an evaporation pond in Tulare Lake Basin, California. They have 3, I believe now they're working on a 4th one, and they have not already been there. I visited there in the year, I think about 10 years ago. I have not visited with them in 10 years. So, but I believe I read that they had already 3 large evaporation ponds, some of the larger evaporation ponds that we have seen, and they're working on the 4th one. Fact number 11, an aquifer lying below an evaporation basin can become contaminated with salts percolating through the vadose zone. In other words, an evaporation basin not only is an eyesore in some sense, right? There's no life out there. There not can be any life. You know, look at that. Look at that in the back in here. What life is there? It's all white. It's all salt, collection of salt. But that salt eventually, rain and everything else will get into the groundwater. So you're holding it in a place where you can't really keep it tight. It will actually get into the groundwater. That has been documented, by the way. Fact number 12, aquifers flow from zones of higher potential to zones of lower potential in a direction that resembles or closely parallels the land surface. This is a very good figure put together by the GS, the Geological Survey. The way water works is that it rains and it percolates. And the tendency for it to move is vertical, mostly vertical. And once it gets to the groundwater, it switches. It switches almost 90%, 90 to 90, 91 degrees, and it moves with the gradient, with the prevailing gradient. Very little of it gets to go further down. We know that. That's been documented too. In fact, number 13, the more intensely a river basin is developed for irrigation, the greater the quantity of salts that need to be handled or disposed of through salt-laden runoff and stream flow. That is the example of the Salton Sea. We know that. We already examined that. So this is fascinating and interesting. The Salton Sea was allowed to collect for 100 years the runoff from agriculture, the agricultural sewage, while the Central Valley was not allowed. Well, to an extent, but let's say most of the Central Valley salt that has been generated over the last 120 years has actually made its way to the ocean, right by San Francisco. Little by little, but it has. Now, there are some places where the exoraism has been converted into endoraism, and then the salt was not allowed to get out. And we'll talk about that later. But it's a small area. It's a small area. That's actually the area that we call Tulare. It's been referred to as Tulare. It's the southern portion of the Central Valley. Okay, so that is one paper, and I already told you I'm going to quick on this. And this one, I would like you to review this paper carefully, okay? But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight, because if I spend a lot of time on this, we will spend the entire hour on this paper. And I don't want to do that at this point. You know we're short of time. So this is a paper I wrote, I don't know, many years ago. Oh, this was 11, 12 years ago. It's dated the year 2009. sustainable runoff or basin salt balance. At that time, we were studying Tulare, we were studying all sorts of other projects, the Salton Sea and so forth. So I became concerned, or I guess you could say fascinated, that if we held to all the runoff, we were going to hold on to all the salt. And that's a truism. So the issue of how much runoff should we hold on to, it's an issue of strategy. It's an issue of political strategy and design. And why do I say political? Because everybody that shares land in a certain watershed, like for instance the Central Valley, has a southern watershed, the San Joaquin, and a northern watershed, the Sacramento. And everybody's together. Like, let's take a look at the San Joaquin. Everybody out there in the San Joaquin is producing salt. Everybody that's irrigating is producing salt. And the salt is being collected by the river and transported and taken northern towards the San Francisco Bay Area. So you can't say, oh, well, these guys are doing more and so forth. Everybody is responsible for the production of extra salt because they're irrigating. And they are producing, in some sense, no, in a very good sense, extra salt. So the question is, and has been posed in the past in political terms, how much should we afford to let the water run into the ocean? And some people argue that we should not. Water is precious. Let's hold on to all of it. That's incorrect, of course. On the long term, it's not sustainable. Because if you hold on, particularly if it's irrigation, if you hold on to all the salt, you're holding on to all the water. If it's irrigation, for sure. If it's potable use, not really. Because what's going to happen is that you use the water, you drink the water, and then you urinate it, and finally it goes back, and the salts are passed through your body, basically. Because every glass of water that we drink from the tap has salt. Concentration of salt in the San Diego tap water is about 475 ppm, which is about 50% more than normal. Why is that? Because we know that when they designed the situation for San Diego, they were going to get the water from the east, and that was too salty. So they figured, let's get it from the north, half of it, from the east, half of it. We'll mix it, and we'll bring it down from 800 to 475. And that because the water from the north, from California, is clean. It's really clean. There's a river out there in the triangle, the wet triangle in Northern California, that reports a ppm of about 80. I don't remember the name of the river right now. ppm of 80 is very small. Normal ppm is 200 to 250. Okay, so this paper does a computation of how much runoff should we let go based on a design. What is that? I have somebody making noise in there, competing. Okay. Based on a design, we need to release a certain amount of water. A basin, if it's managed properly, cannot afford to hold on to all this water, particularly if it's for irrigation, because it will produce, it will hold on to all the salts. That is the example of Tulare, by the way. And we're going to get back into Tulare later on. So let me just get into detail. But I want you to read this paper carefully, okay? And it's going to require some time because it's not easy. And I discuss in here the effect of irrigation on runoff, the concept of salt balance that was introduced by this gentleman that I mentioned earlier, professor over at the University of California, I believe it was Riverside, right? He was the dean of engineering before he retired in the 1980s. And he put a lot of these concepts together in his papers. So the concept of salt balance is the first time I heard about salt balance, maybe 20 years ago, from this gentleman. So we have equations in here. These are chemical equations of concentration, okay? And in here we're saying that we need to reserve with a highly developed basin, we have anthropogenic over Q naught is 30%. So 30% of the flow would need to get out in order to keep some strategy for conserving the watershed. We can't leave it the way it was before we got in, because that is impossible. That cannot be sustained from an economic standpoint. But what we could do is mitigate or minimize the effect. And that's exactly what we're doing with these calculations. Now, like I said, I want you to review all these equations. We can't at this point spend time on them because obviously I read every equation here will take the entire hour. And I came to that conclusion today because I've written this paper 10 years ago, and still, even I wrote it, I still have to think about it every time we came to an equation. Remember I said before, the readability of a paper is in inverse proportion to the number of equations that it has. And in here, we have 15 equations already. And never mind, they're simple equations, but you still have to think about an equation. Okay, case study. We go to the case study. Somewhat extreme case of combined natural and anthropogenic salt sequestration is represented by Tulare Lake Basin. Tulare is in the southern extremity of California's Central Valley. Tulare functions as an indirect basin most of the times, collecting its own local and regional runoff, plus the eventual seasonal overflow from the Kings River located to the north. However, during extreme periods of local and regional runoff from Tulare Lake was known to reverse direction and flow northwards towards the San Joaquin River. What happened with Tulare was interesting and actually fascinating from a standpoint of development. This river, prior to development, prior to the 1880s, okay, prior to development, it was semi-exorrheic, meaning every couple of years it overflowed through a natural levee over there, not a natural levee, a natural spillway. It over here somewhere. It overflowed at a certain elevation and it went back to the Pacific every couple of years. So by doing so, it would wash the basin from its salts, because you know the salts get picked up readily by the water. So its runoff water will pick up all the salts, right? So it's like flushing. So every couple of years it will flush all the salts. So that we came in toward the end of the 19th century and decided to irrigate the lake. It was a lake. This is a Tulare Lake over here. And we decided to irrigate the lake, and in order to do that, we had to hold on to all the water. Every drop of water from then on, for 120 years, that came into this region was kept and used for productivity, for irrigation. Cotton, things that we eat, right? I think cotton is important in here. I mean, not important, but it's important in terms of the quantity that is produced. And therefore, what happened was that by holding to every iota of runoff, they also held to every iota of salt. So for the last 120 years, not one iota of salt has been released. In other words, this is an anthropogenic system. They're holding on to all the water, and they're holding on to all the salt. They've become very productive. It's a very productive system out there. The soils are good. Typically, desert soils are good. They're good for a long while. Well, I don't really know how long, but they're good, generally good. Everybody knows that same thing happened over in the Salton Sea. Okay. In the past 120 years, irrigation has resulted in the conversion of all runoff to vaporization. While the intention of irrigation is to convert runoff into evapotranspiration, a significant portion of runoff is actually converted into evaporation because they have evaporation basins over here. Evaporation basins. Every drop of water is not in the basin is now captured. For the time being, the irrigation system works because the drainage carries the salt brine away from the root zone, and it accumulates in evaporation ponds. This is a picture, a photo, one of 3 evaporation ponds that were out there on the southern eastern edge of the valley when I was there in the year 2008, I believe. 2008 was when I was there. Subsequently, we wrote this paper. As the system continues to operate, the need for additional evaporation basins becomes apparent. I think I already told you they were thinking several years ago on the 4th one. it is clear that the system is unsustainable, carrying with it the certainty of its eventual demise. When I was there, I talked to the engineer in the field and I said, excuse me, how many more years do you think you can operate this system? And he says, well, we have calculated 60, he said. 60. He gave me that figure. He knew, based on projections that have been made, that they could operate the system, that kind of system, which is unsustainable, for 60 more years. And then after that, well, gosh, he wasn't going to be around. I wasn't going to be around either. So conceptual analysis formulated herein demonstrate that a minimum anthropogenic to pristine runoff ratio must be preserved in irrigation development if a basin is to achieve some measure of salt balance. This is interesting and fascinating because it says that this thing, even though it's private property, as far as the water and the land is concerned, it should be regarded as a commons as far as the salt is concerned. How fascinating. This is not being argued in many places, in most places. It's a commons, meaning everybody owns it and they're all share on its behavior or management. Because if one thing goes bad, everybody's going to suffer, right? So it's a commons. And I actually have a video on this. I have several videos. I posted all the videos on the theme video page for you to take a look at. There's a maximum limit to the amount of runoff that can be appropriated. Disregarding this limit leads to a loss of basin salt balance, which is what Pillsbury is his name, and now I remember. Professor Pillsbury from University of California, Riverside, back in the 70s and 80s. He retired, I believe, in the year 1981. And subsequently, right after he retired, he wrote a great paper, which is called River Basin Salinity. This is interesting because Pillsbury spent 50 years working on irrigation. And then at the end, he realized that he had produced a lot of projects and done a lot of good work, but it also created some problems. That at the end, he came out and clarified for everybody because he knew what he was talking. He had already seen it. In other words, the preservation of water quality must not be achieved at the expense of the degradation of land quality, because that's exactly what we're doing here. We're preserving water quality, but the land quality is being degraded. And you guys have heard about water quality. We've heard about water quality for 50 years now. But land quality is relatively new, and yet one leads to the other. Okay, so I'm going to stop in there, and now I'm going to show a video, because this is only a video. Tulare Lake Basin is located in the southern San Joaquin Valley in California. It is home to some of the most productive irrigated agriculture in the world. The fields are maintained in top condition by drainage, which removes excess salts from the root zone. The drainage waters, which contain a high concentration of salts, are being stored in evaporation ponds. Since there is no salt export, the salts continue to accumulate, with no apparent end in sight. To this date, about 3% of the land has been compromised by the evaporation ponds. This to this date is 10 years ago, by the way. There is a risk that the salt stored in the evaporation ponds may eventually percolate down into the underlying aquifers. This fact was mentioned by Pillsbury in his paper. Tulare Lake Basin is a semi-endorheic basin located near the southern extremity of the San Joaquin Valley. Until the late 19th century, Tulare Lake was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River. The lake was maintained by tributary inflow from the Kern, Tully, Kaweah, and Kings rivers. About every 2 years, the lake would fill up, causing the Kings River to reverse its direction and to flow north into the San Joaquin River. From 1850 to 1878, the overflow occurred in 19 out of 29 years. Therefore, under pristine conditions, Tulare Lake functioned as a semi-endorheic basin, occasionally flushing its salts into the San Joaquin River and to the Pacific Ocean. By 1899, following intensive development, water diversions caused the lake to dry up, except for residual wetlands and infrequent floods. The development of agriculture prevented the natural overflow and washing of the salts from the basin. In the 20th century, with the lake dry, agriculture moved in, eventually to develop one of the most productive irrigation systems in the world. The disappearance of the lake meant the elimination of the overflow and the storage of all salts within the closed basin. Salinity management at Tulare Lake is currently considering several options. The prevailing strategy continues to be salt storage in evaporation ponds. Since salts are not being exported, they continue to accumulate, compromising increasing portions of the basin. Other strategies include the reuse of drainage waters by growing salt-tolerant species such as Jose tall wheatgrass and pistachios. Technological advances are currently being explored to determine whether the salts can be separated by chemical processes and their components sold for commercial uses. The salts consist primarily of sodium sulfate and sodium chloride, with small amounts of selenium, the latter of geologic origin. The commercial solution hinges on the development of appropriate markets for the salt products. Export of salts through a brine line to the Pacific Ocean is a costly but effective means of assuring the sustainability of Tulare Lake Basin. Achieving salt balance in Tulare Lake Basin remains a challenge to this date. In passing, let me get in here. Finishing up this, I should mention to you as a side comment that I produced this video after my visit in the year 2008. I'm not sure if it was 2008 or 2012. But at any rate, yeah, it may have been 2012, actually, because this was done in 2013. And I sent it to the people over there for examination, and they didn't like it, and they told me not to publish it. Really, yeah. They didn't like it. They didn't like it because I said that the problem had not been solved. They think that they have solved the problem, which of course is not quite correct. They're still collecting the salt, and they really think that it can be solved. So basically, for a number of years, I put a lid on this video, but eventually then I said, what the heck, I released it. So now it's open, but it used to be covered with a password on my site. Okay, so let's move on in here. The salinity of groundwater. This also has a video, by the way. There's videos for all these, so you can reinforce your knowledge later on. Salinity of groundwaters. Are the groundwaters saline? That is a very good question. Well, we owe the clarity in the answer to this video, or to this question, to Shebot Taref, who was, I believe he was originating in Russia, but he did a lot of his work here in the United States as well as in, I believe, Australia. So water is a precious and scarce resource. Given the needs of economic development, it is very likely that water will continue to remain a scarce resource in the future, right? We have increase in the number of people, mouths to feed, and so forth, but the water remains the same. Not only does it remain the same, it is kind of reduced because now, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, there's a new kid on the block, as they say, the environment, the flora, the fauna, which prior to that, we didn't pay too much attention to. right? But now we have to. It's in the law. We now have to respect the environmental laws, environmental rules. Surface water constitutes only a small fraction of the total amount of fresh water. That is true. We know that. Therefore, societies are increasingly turning to groundwater to satisfy the demand for fresh water. In other words, there's 100 times more groundwater than surface water, at least 100 times more. Surface water has a tendency to be mostly fresh, while groundwater is, depends on where you look at it, and it depends on how deep you go, according to CIVE633. If you go deep enough, you get all salt water, very saline water, which you could not drink. You'd have to make it, you have to process it through reverse osmosis and situations like that. While the quantity of groundwater pumping is related to the issue of sustainability, the quality of groundwater remains a cause for concern. Pumping saline groundwaters has the unintended negative consequence of bringing large amounts of salts to the surface, which require costly and often cumbersome disposal. And here it brings to bear the example of the Cayewas pipeline. They, over there, they had to develop, and you know, when you develop a neighborhood and you build 2, 3, 5,000 houses, you got to provide water. You got to find the water. You're not gonna sell the houses and tell the guys that bought the house, I'm sorry, there's no water here. No, you got to assure the supply of water. So these people out there for the last 20 years have been pumping the groundwater. Exact depths, I don't know, but what I know that is it coming out salty. So they figured out that they couldn't do anything but they were faced against a situation where you couldn't develop unless you pumped the salt water, the groundwater, which was salty. So then they decided to desalinize the reverse osmosis, and they did that. And I don't know how long did it take them, because I don't know all the details. I just know the broad aspects. How long did it take them to figure out that they had to send that water into the ocean, which they did in the year 2005, 2007. I was there 2007 and I saw the brine line being built, and I think I've shown you pictures of it. And now the brine line is operating. And I think I mentioned to you that I said to the engineer that was in the field, I said, boy, this is a huge pipeline. It was a 4 feet diameter. I said, that's huge. Surely you don't have that much water in there. And he says, no, we don't intend to do this pipeline in 100 years. We figured out that in 100 years it get full. Interesting. $60 million of that time went into the construction of the Cayewas brine line. You can Google it if you're interested in more detail. The geochemistry of natural groundwater. CIVE633 in 1955 pioneered the systematic study of the geochemistry of natural groundwaters. In the crust of weathering. The crust of weathering is what CIVE633 defined as the 10-kilometer depth of the crust of the earth. He figured that earthquakes and so forth had actually made this crust that had holes in there in the rock that could hold water. Because you know the soil is not that deep. There are places there's no soil. In some places there's no soil. The soil is the alluvial stuff, the quaternary stuff that's only 1 million years old, or even less, 1 million, 2 million. The geology is 200, 300, 500 million years, even 1,000 million, or 1 billion years, right? So, so that's the crust of weathering, which CIVE633 estimates as being 10 kilometers. There's where water is. So you can, if we could, provided we don't use a whole lot of fossil fuels, we could pump that water up to 10 kilometers. Right now we're pumping it, my guess is that it's 1,000, 1 kilometer, certainly. 2, maybe. More than 2, it becomes costly because you got to lift the water, you got to raise the water. It takes a lot of energy to do that. And typically that energy nowadays is fossil. So we need to reconcile the fact that we're still using large amounts of fossil fuels, and not just in transportation. Okay. Always moving along, the water is always moving along a hydrodynamic gradient. So the groundwater is always moving. If it doesn't move, it gets to the surface. And if it gets to the surface, it evaporates, so it's gone. So the groundwater is always moving. A gentleman that said that was, my memory is bad today, guy that was a father of hydrogeology, 1940. He's got a great paper, which we read, I believe we read it in one of our classes. And he basically said groundwater is always moving. If it's not moving, it's not groundwater. That's what he said. It comes to the surface and it's evaporated. So this is a great graph. I love this graph. This is from the GS, which is exactly the way it is. Following ions are present in natural groundwaters. Anions are bicarbonate, sulfate, and chloride. Carbonate, sulfate, and chloride. That's interesting. Cations, sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Depending on the salinity, the quality of groundwater falls into three categories. Fresh water, between 0 and 1%. Salinized, between 1 and 3.5%. That's the percentage of ocean water, 3.5%. And saline water, from 3.5 to 35. 3.5 is the division between ocean water, right? Ocean water is 3.5. Why 35? Because 35 is the maximum concentration that it could have, 35.7 actually. Above that, it kind of settles down and it becomes saline rock. That happens, for instance, in Uyuni Salt Lake, in Bonneville, in Utah, and so forth. You got the salt flats because the concentration reached 35.7, and at that point, it became solid. Okay, the 35.7 is the limit. The 35.7 limit is the saturation of concentration of sodium chloride in water at 20 degrees Celsius. Metamorphism of groundwaters, hydrodynamic and hydrochemical gradients affect the distribution. There are three hydrodynamic zones in groundwater flow, according to Chebotarev. The zone of active exchange, the zone of delayed exchange, and the zone of stagnant conditions. We undertook to give it a little nice face to Chebotarev's graph. We designed this graph. I mean, it was his design, but it was in black and white. We put color in it. So you have active exchange, where you have mostly bicarbonate salts. Then you have the delay exchange with sulfate waters. And then the deep waters, which don't move a whole lot, they're slow moving, slow gradients, and so forth. Those are chloride waters. And why should that be that way? And the answer is, it's initial solubility. Solubility is a chemical concept that expresses the tendency of salts or all salts basically, to become soluble, to dissolve in water. And the sodium chloride has the highest solubility, so it's the one that it will take longer to get out. By itself, probably never. Okay, and that is why it accumulates in the deep recesses of the groundwater. And as you can see in here, now there are some numbers in here that are not 100% clear, from 0 to 3.8, from 0 to 1.9, so sulfate appears to have less concentration, but then it goes on the chloride from 0 to 35.7. You see in here, 35.7. So the chloride are very saline. Now the issue is, where's the limit? I don't know, to be honest with you. And I don't think Chebotarev gave a limit. I read his 3 papers many years ago. I should go back and read them. Difficult papers to read, because this gentleman was not an engineer, he was a biochemist. I'm sorry, a chemist. Not biochemist, a chemist. So he was talking a lot of chemistry out there, and you know, we have limits. All engineers have limits in terms of the science, because we're not scientists, we're engineers. But at any rate, I was able to successfully put together this graph, which everybody likes, by the way. People have told me about this. And there's an exchange in here, and there's equations that he says that Chebotarev sequence is from bicarbonate waters, they become sulfate waters as they go deeper, and then eventually when they go really, really deep, they become chloride waters. So if you want to pump it at 5,000, 6,000 feet, you're going to get chloride waters. Never mind that if you pump at that depth, you pump a whole lot of water at that depth, you may produce an earthquake, because you're pumping the water out. The pumping was holding the whole thing together, right? And it has happened before. There are some unforeseen effects of groundwater pumping. In my mind, we should be pumping groundwater in minute amounts. We should not pump groundwater, but that is unrealistic politically and economically at this stage in which we are. I told you 45% of the water in California comes from the groundwater. And I did say the other day that my preference would be that it be 20 or 10%, because we know the effects. But unfortunately, we don't make the decisions. We just present the facts. The decisions are made by those people that are in power, the politicians. Salinity gradients. The salinity of groundwaters increases as a function of distance from the recharge area, proximity to the sea, because the seawater gets in a little bit, and time of travel through the water-bearing geologic formations. Right, the time of travel is very important. The issue is, why are those deep groundwater saline, particularly sodium chloride? And the answer is, because they've been there for a long time. And there's this solution in process, always. So the longer the time, the more chance, the higher the chance for the salts to get dissolved out of the profile, of the rock profile, and get into the water. So conclusions on the Chebotarev study. Salinity of groundwaters is a function of the local water exchange rate. As drainage conditions deteriorate with depth, the water exchange rate is reduced and the salinity increases. The cycle of metamorphism of groundwater ranges from bicarbonate waters to sulfate waters to chloride waters as a function of increasing depth, reduced drainage, right? Because increasing depth, reduced drainage, reduced gradients, therefore reduced drainage. If you have zero gradient, there's no drainage. The water is static, immobile, in longer time, because the deeper the water is, the longer it has been there. Pumping groundwater may have the, at great depths, may have the unintended consequence of bringing large quantities of salt to the surface. Therefore, caution is recommended when pumping groundwater at great depths, particularly for consumptive uses such as irrigation. Right, if you use it for potable water, like I told you, the effects are minimal. But for irrigation, they're maximum. Because irrigation, plants don't take any salt. The salt has to be eliminated. Well, we can take salt. We can drink a little bit of salt. You know, there's, like I told you, in San Diego, water 475. I have a patio here in the back of my home. What does that have to do with the discussion? Well, we just put the patio about 6 months ago, and I noticed that the surface has been getting salty. I'm going to have to go in there and apply high pressure and flush the salt all out into the drainage. So it'll go into somebody else's property, not mine, right? Now, I want my nice patio, right? So I'm going to have to wash that because it is accumulating salt, and you know that. You have had that experience. The traders are, and why is it accumulating salt? Is there a whole lot of salt? No, there's a very small amount of salt, but it's been 6 months, and the salt doesn't travel readily, and it has a tendency to stick to the floor, right? So it's there. Trade-offs of using deep groundwater versus bringing excessive amount of salt to the surface must be evaluated carefully. Very few people are doing this at this point. That is what I believe. Overriding objective should be to keep the basin in salt balance, as Pillsbury said that we should. Sustainability, by the use of a suitable brine line. There should be brine lines built all over the place, in my opinion. It should be the job of the future engineers to build brine lines. We have 2 or 3, I believe 3 in California. I don't know how many are being planned to be built because these concepts that I'm elaborating here today are not new. I mean, if they were new, I mean, the Calleguas brine line would not have been built. I was actually, was it right there? But I did go to visit. It was not the Calleguas, it was the Santa Ana, because the Santa Ana watershed also has a brine line. So I went to the Santa Ana. There's a place out there that is called the Santa Ana Salinity Management something. It's a building and it has a lot of people out there working and thinking. So I met with the lady that was head of this. That was about 10 years ago. And I just wanted to chat with her a little bit about what they were doing and get permission to visit their facilities. And he said to me, Professor Ponce, we are now 100% on the concept of salt balance, basin salt balance. I had already, of course, read about it in Pillsbury. Pillsbury was the first one that introduced me to the concept back 10, 15 years ago. But I heard it from the lion's mouth. I heard it from her. She was the boss out there. She was telling me that they were after salt balance. That's very cool, very nice. This occurred in the year 2007. So there's people out there that are already on top of this, and they seek to, once they understand it, to fix it. Okay, the facts about the San Joaquin Valley drainage. The facts about the San Joaquin Valley drainage. This is a very nice, clear enumeration of facts that I wrote in the year, it's not dated, but I believe it's about 10 years ago. It's dated 2007, by the way. And I'm going to go over, I'm not going to go spend a whole lot of time because it's very clear, you can read it on your own. Okay, but it comes with a set of statements that are hard to argue with. Okay, the San Joaquin Valley is located in the Central Valley. Who's going to argue with that? Okay, the valley is drained by the San Joaquin River, which flows southwest and then northwest toward the Sacramento San Joaquin. The uplift in the coastal range has literally closed the valley and resulted in the creation of extensive flatlands. This is interesting. There was an uplift of the coastal. There's uplift on the Sierra, the California Sierra, but there was also about a million years ago, perhaps even more. I mean, I'm not a geologist. There was an uplift of the coastal range. So the coastal range uplifted and it created the Central Valley. And the Central Valley, it was in the Lake. It was in the lake. I should write this thing down. It was in the lake. In other words, it was a lake. And 600,000 years ago, it broke, it breached. There was a big flood and it breached. This is documented on the web, by the way. I'm not telling you stories that I did not read. 600,000 years ago, it was, as according to geologists, it breached and it created the outlet of the combined Sacramento-San Joaquin rivers. Sacramento coming from the north and the San Joaquin coming from the south. They meet over east of San Francisco and they exit. And as a result of that, the lake in the Central Valley dried out. Of course, it dried out and it became a land, very flat land between two mountains. That's exactly what it is. Okay. The southernmost portion of the San Joaquin encompasses the Tulare Lake basin, which is drained by the Kings, Kaweah, Tule, and Kern rivers, right? The western half of the San Joaquin suffers from insufficient drainage. The drainage is not only an issue of gradient, it's also an issue of soils. If the soils are thick, they won't drain. In order to drain, you have to have sandy soils or silty sand at the very least, okay? The flatlands contain arable land, suitable for agriculture. That is correct. We discovered that about 100 years ago, meaning settlement in California, which happened about 120, 130 years ago. Since 1960, the government has developed irrigation projects. The state of California completed the State Water Project in 1968 with the building of the two dams, Oroville and Shasta, in the northern part, in the Sacramento River, actually further north of the Sacramento River. I don't know the details, but I believe at least Oroville, let me see that. Oroville is in the Feather River, which is, I believe, part of the Sacramento. But Shasta may not, because, you know, up there, I guess I'm going to say, there's two big dams, Shasta and Oroville. Shasta the largest, second Oroville. Oroville is the dam that almost failed in the year 2017. We had a weird weather connected with El Nino, Pacific El Nino, and there was a whole lot of rainfall in a very large basin, and it collected it and threatened the Oroville Reservoir, and it almost breached or broke. Had it broken, it would have killed a lot of people, but it didn't because we were lucky. At the end, when it all got full, all that happened was the two spillways broke. They failed, but right after the spillways failed, I guess God, if we could describe it that way, figured out that we had had enough, and all of a sudden, the rain stopped. We were able to fix it, spending a lot of money, but we fixed it. The state of California completed the State Water Project. The State Water Project provides irrigation water. The San Luis Canal was completed in 1968. This is a picture of the San Luis Canal. This is actually called the San Luis. This is interesting, politically interesting. There's one canal in there, and it's one. In one part, it's called the California Aqueduct, and in some other part, it's called the San Luis Canal. So I was curious as to why they had two names, and the answer is because the California Aqueduct was built by California, while the San Luis Canal was built by the federal people, the Bureau of Reclamation. So they decided to give them different names. It's the same canal. It runs about 16, I believe 16, 15 to 16,000 CFS. It's a large canal. It gets all the water from north to south. Well, that's the water we drink, by the way, 50% of it. 50% of it gets, and the water gets to LA, and then 50% of their water, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. 50% of our water here in San Diego is coming from this canal. The other 50% is coming from the Colorado through the All-American Canal. Westland's Water District, largest agency in charge of water deliveries. Farms within Westland produce $1 billion worth of food and fiber. The CVVs, the Central Valley Project, guaranteed not only reliable water for irrigation, but also the drainage. Basically, they told the people that were gonna settle the Imperial Valley, they gave him, I believe they gave him 960 acres for some reason. For some reason that I am fascinated by it, that the story and the history of the Central Valley is not the same as Imperial Valley. They're totally different. It's like two different countries, and yet they're in the same states. Salton Sea did not drain their salt. These guys are draining the salt because they obviously were facilitated by the fact that there was a river there. The Salton Sea has no river, right? So basically, according to the geomorphology, the politicians had to sort it all out and do whatever was necessary at the right time at the right place, and that's how they did it. So if you look at the history of the Salton Sea, it's totally different from the history of this project, or rather of the San Joaquin Valley. 42,000 acres of land were connected to the San Luis Drain. In the Salton Sea, to make a comparison, they had to build in the early 1900s, in the early 2000s, no, 1900. 1905, 1910, up to 1920, they had to undergo the construction of the drains, because without the drains, the thing wasn't going to work. So once they put the drains in there, then the water started to drain, and then they figured out that it could go downstream. Nobody's going to pump that stuff. Well, they didn't want to. Pumping is expensive. So it went to the hole, and then eventually they got permission to put the water in the hole. We already seen that. Water drained from the fields contain high concentration of salts, including sodium sulfate, sodium chloride, calcium sulfate, and calcium carbonate. In addition, it has high concentration of trace minerals, including selenium, arsenic, boron, and molybdenum. Selenium appears to be a gift of God to the valley. The valley is full of selenium. I know that. I've been there. I've talked to people. Okay. Selenium in parts per billion is a nutrient, and in parts per million is extremely toxic, not only for humans, but also for animals. Construction of the San Luis Drain. So in 1968, the government decided that they had to, well, both governments, federal and state government, decided that they had to do the San Luis Drain. Started in 68, and by 75, 82% of the, no, 82 of the 188 miles. So the San Luis Drain is over here. Here's the San Luis Drain, over here. Starts in here, and it starts at the bottom of the San Luis unit, and it goes up here, and it stops at Kesterton. It stops at Kesterton. Kesterton is a wild area out there, east of South San Francisco. Okay. At the time, 1975, Congress ordered the Bureau of Reclamation not to complete the San Luis Drain, because the people from San Francisco they were at the time, and they, I believe, continue to be politically powerful. They said, we don't want their trash polluting our bay. The trash meaning sewage. I mean, agricultural sewage, which they consider trash, of course. So they stopped it politically. They said, you can't do it. You got to do some other way, which is very short-sighted in my opinion. But who am I to say that to 25 years, 55 years later? This is 75, right? With the drainage project halted, drainage water was placed into Kesterton. So they had to figure out a place to put the drainage water. So they looked around for a place, and they found a place that wasn't too bad, and they put it in Kesterton. You can imagine how this thing progressed. They was draining. They were building the canal, and all of a sudden they had to put it over here, and they were not allowed to get further north than that. Kesterton is within 100 miles from San Francisco. Near the town of Augustine 80 miles south of the Sacramento. It's 80 miles. In the late 1970s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife took over the management. Here we go. The third guys that come in are the Fish and Wildlife, and they say, hey, we got a lake here, like in the Salton Sea. Let's do some fish. Let's put some animals in there. Fish and Wildlife Service. These are biologists, wildlife biologists. Okay. However, the thing went awry because in the year 1993, there were many documented cases of mortality and embryonic deformities among waterfowl in Kesterton Reservoir. Basically, the reservoir was full of selenium, which had accumulated, and the birds took the water with the selenium, high concentrations of selenium. Studies revealed that the water had very high levels of selenium, naturally occurring element present in the drainage waters. In other words, the selenium, it comes in low concentrations, but you can accumulate. You can, like anything else, it's a solid. It doesn't go anywhere. Selenium is a micronutrient. A large concentration is very toxic. Acting upon the selenium contamination, the U.S. government closed the San Luis Drain in Kesterton Reservoir. They closed it. I was in there in the year 2010, I think, and they won't let me in. I had to get some permission, and I couldn't get the permission, you know. So I could not get in to see Kesterton. I wanted to take pictures of it. They won't let me. They didn't let me. Closure of the San Luis Drain effectively stopped drainage services to the west. So in other words, if there's no drain, there's no drainage. So then the San Luis unit people, which are powerful people, there's a lot of people out there. They have 960 acres, which is a lot. In an arid land is a lot. Remember, the productivity of arid lands is higher than the other lands that are not arid because of the new nutrients, the native, how can I say, the juvenile nutrients coming out of the soil. Okay, so in the 1990s, landowners sued the interior. You stopped the drainage. You're not draining our lands. And you said you would. 30 years ago, you said you would. Okay. In the year 2000, upon appeal of that order, the Ninth Circuit affirmed that reclamation had a mandatory duty to provide drainage to the San Luis unit. In other words, the judges, the lawyers looked at it and said, well, you guys promised it 30 years ago. You're not doing it now. You should do it. But they held that it had the discretion to provide service other than through an interceptor drain to the delta. In other words, you could do several things. You could do it any which way you wanted as long as you mitigate the problem. Reclamation has determined that a total of 379,000 acres will require drainage service. There's got some drainage in there. This is a picture of a working drain in the San Joaquin Valley. A drain is not, it differs from a canal in that it is deeper. The canal usually is water surface at 1 foot or 2 feet, but the drainage, the water surface is at 4 feet, as you can see in there. Why? Because it's got to provide gradient to the adjacent land so that it will drain. If the drain is too high, it will not drain. It will not serve the purpose. Okay. In 2005, reclamation presented 7 alternatives, ranging from delta or ocean disposal to drainage flow reduction through land retirement. In other words, they said we can reduce the drainage amount by retiring land. That's a possibility. 4 alternatives provide drainage services to all 379,000 acres. Compare that to the Salton. Salton is, Imperial Valley is 200,000 acres. So this area here, over here, is twice as big as the Imperial Valley. Okay. 3 other alternatives combine in-valley evaporation with various levels of land retirement. In-valley evaporation is no good, in my opinion, because it will eventually, sooner or later, contaminate the groundwater. You either dispose it in the ocean or don't do it. That's my solution to it. Okay, they don't do it is hard, but that's the only way to solve the problem, unless you throw it into the ocean, which you have to be allowed to do that. It's not easy, because there's always the NIMBY situation. Don't do it in my backyard. Go out there, somewhere else, but not here. These alternatives would cease irrigation and so forth, so some irrigation would have to close. Evaporation ponds would also be part of the solution. the Bureau of Reclamation came up with a solution with evaporation ponds. They should have read Pillsbury, who said clearly in his paper that the evaporation pond was like shooting yourself in the foot. Eventually, you'll have to pay for it. Because the cost of the alternatives range from 589 million to 918 million. That's 2007 figures. At this point, you're talking at least double or triple. In March 2007, Reclamation decided to pursue the in-valley water needs, which includes drainage reduction, drainage reuse, treatment systems, evaporation ponds, and retirement. Federal government plans to buy the lands from the owners and retire them from agricultural use. In other words, the land's been messed up, full of salt. You can't drain it because nobody wants you to drain it, and now they're going to use it for something else. The cost of the lands will be assessed as if the lands were fully under production, and drainage had been implemented. I wonder who's going to pay for that. Or here, they figure it out. Because one thing is, I mean, this is the way it looks now. Drainage affect the land. It's a mess. It's no good for anything, right? So the actual cost is hardly anything. But if it were under production, then it would be 10 times more or 5 times more. I don't know the number, but it's a lot more costly. The revised cost of providing drainage service is 2.6 billion. No, what's a billion? Nothing. 2.6 billion. I should caution you that this paper was written in the year 2007, and I have not updated it. So many of those, a few of the facts, I would say here, maybe dated. Who knows? We haven't done work in this area for 10 years. But for all it's worth, I think it's a good summary of what has gone on and went on in that place. Now we have a case of drainage, the story of Wellton-Mohawk. This is a good one. I think we have 10 minutes. We can cover this one. Wellton-Mohawk is an irrigation project located in the lower Gila River in southwestern Arizona, east of Yuma. Over the years, the name has come to represent the problems of salt management in arid lands. Despite the bad publicity, Wellton-Mohawk is managing to do one thing. It is draining the return flows to the ocean directly. So Wellton-Mohawk is doing something that San Joaquin is not doing and Salton is not doing, the draining to the ocean. Okay. Many irrigation projects, including San Joaquin, do not come close to accomplishing this objective. They're not draining. Wellton-Mohawk is draining. How is it that Wellton-Mohawk is draining? This is fascinating. Let's take a look. The story of how Wellton-Mohawk came to drain its return flows to the ocean is convoluted, yet instructive. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation built the project in the late 1940s. In 1951, the Wellton-Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District was created to oversee the irrigation of up to 75,000 acres in the lower Gila Valley, between the towns of Wellton and Mohawk. The water comes from the Colorado River through the Gila Canal to the Wellton-Mohawk Canal, and it is pumped to the headwaters, a total of 160 feet. In other words, the water originates in the Colorado, but you got to get it upstream to the head of the project. So they are pumping that water. This is the Wellton-Mohawk Canal being pumped. You can see that the water is being pushed in the front. I'm taking this from the pump station. So the water is being pushed upstream. It's really amazing. But yet, on the other hand, it's got some good story at the end. Okay, it's really amazing that. So Wellton-Mohawk is the only project that I know of that is pumping the water to go in and pumping the water to get out. Both of them are being used, of course, using fossil fuels. They're not pumping it with butter. They're using fossil fuels in order to pump this. I don't know if they're using wind. They could start using wind eventually, but I don't know. I don't know that for a fact. Initially, the Bureau underestimated the need for drainage and did not build the drainage infrastructure. Within a few years, the lack of drainage led to rising water tables and increased salinity, a situation which made it absolutely necessary to drain the lands, which is exactly the same thing that happened in Salton, the Salton Basin, Imperial Valley. In desperation, farmers began to use the old wells. So, prior to irrigation, they have a few wells out there because they were getting water from the groundwater instead of getting it from the Colorado. So note that the name Wellton comes from Welltown. There was a bunch of wells out there in Wellton, old wells. So they started using the old wells in order to pump, to get rid of the water that was to lower the water table so that they could grow. Because what happens is when you have salinity, not only the water table goes up because there's no drainage, and then the water table, the water contains a lot of salts, and therefore you can't produce anything. You can't produce anything. The, the farmers pump the groundwater, lower the water table, and built a master drain to collect the pump return flows. Yes, correct. In 1961, Wellton-Mohawk return flows began flowing to the Gila River, eventually to make their way to the Colorado. Fascinating. There's the entrance to the project has two canals, one going upstream, which is a big canal, and it's being pumped, and one going downstream, which is a much smaller canal, about 13 to 15% of the flow. But that flow is salty already. It's the product of the pumping of the groundwater. But that one's going by gravity. That's flowing downstream. Okay, there's pictures of that. I think I'll show you later on. Okay, the salinity of the Colorado at Imperial Dam increased from 693, which was the background in 1945, to 894 in 1970. In other words, Wellton-Mohawk the project was responsible for a jump of about 200 ppm on the salinity of the Colorado because we're getting all the salts from the project. This is an extensive project. Acting on this issue, Mexico complained to the United States that the water being delivered to them was too salty because it was a compact, 1948 compact, where we had to give Mexico 1/10 of the Colorado River water in terms of quantity. But the compact said nothing about salt. But then later on, we started giving them salty water from 695 to 895. So Mexico complained. In 1973, the United States agreed to correct the situation, primarily through the treatment of Wellton-Mohawk return flows at a desalination plant to be built in Yuma. The original intent was to treat the return flows with reverse osmosis, return the clean water to the Colorado, and dispose of the brine through a drain into the Gulf. You know, there's always, anytime you use reverse osmosis, there's always a brine. However, there's a goof in here. The plant never worked. I visited the plant 3 or 4 years ago just to find out what is an update. And the plant is still not working and probably will never work. It's too expensive to operate. The Bureau doesn't have the money to operate it. It was a boondoggle, I guess that's what they call it. It was a mistake. Everybody agrees that was a mistake. However, there's an interesting story to this. It's a fascinating, interesting, happy story. The plant, completed in 1992, never went into operation. We got 4 minutes here. The 1973 agreement also required a surface drain to carry brine from the desalination plant, including any untreated Wellton-Mohawk return flows, to coastal waters, which is about 100 miles south in Mexico. Mexico built the extension of this drain from the border to the coast. For 15 years now, the returned flow from Wellton-Mohawk, high in salts, has flowed into Santa Clara Slough in Sonora, Mexico. By all accounts, the slough has benefited from these flows. There are those who argue that the current situation is fine and the flows to the slough should continue. This situation leaves the Yuma desalination plant idle. In other words, you don't need to use the Yuma because the Mexicans now are happy with the salt we're giving them, apparently, according to the story. These stories are all on the web, by the way. You can look them up. Okay, this is a main drain in St. Louis, near to the Mexican border. This is St. Louis, Arizona, near to the border. Right across the border, there's San Luis, Mexico. San Luis, Sonora, Mexico. The current plan is to use the plant only when the flow of the Colorado River is sufficiently low to justify not bypassing, but that's kind of a second thought. Currently, approximately 90 wells are being operated by the Wellton-Mohawk district to keep the depth of the water below the root level, right? You have to keep the lift, otherwise the water they apply, the water that is not used goes up. In fact, Wellton-Mohawk may be one of the few irrigation projects in the world to pump the surface water upstream and then to pump its own groundwater to drain the lands. Yet they're doing one thing right. They're delivering the return flows directly to the ocean where they belong. And here we have the famous picture, which I took. On the right is the main canal. The water's moving in this direction. here in this direction. And on the left is the Wellton-Mohawk drain, the central main drain from Wellton-Mohawk, which I believe we have calculated this is about 13 to 15%. So 1/8. 1/8 of the water coming in is coming out. But notice that these two canals run in opposite directions. I've never seen this. I've actually never seen this. Two canals on the same terrain running in opposite directions. This one is by gravity, and this one is by pumping. So we obviously need to spend a lot of money on pumping. However, the economic situation is good because productivity is extremely high. This is area lands. They have juvenile nutrients. They're good. There's a lot of productivity out there, continuing for 50, 60, 70 years. So it's good. The situation now is at a standstill. Nobody's complaining. Mexico's not complaining. The U.S. is not operating the plant, which cost, I believe, $300 million when it was built 30 years ago. $300 million. I've seen the plant. I was there 5 years ago, as I told you, 4 or 5 years ago. There was one of our students in this class who chose to do an update on the Yuma plant. So we went out there. I said, I'm going to visit with you. We went out there. We spent the day over there because I wanted to just look at it and take some pictures and so forth. And like I said, the situation is kind of in a limbo. Mexico is not complaining. They got a good slough out there. They got the slough is next to the ocean, and therefore it's kind of salty. And we're giving them more salts. So more salts do the same thing. Apparently, you know, I mean, I'm not a biologist, but nobody's complaining, so it's fine so far. You know, people do things when people complain. If they don't complain, then it's fine. Nobody's going to lift a finger to do anything. The end result of the whole thing is that the Yuma plant is not being used, and it probably will not be used. It should be used, in my opinion, and I think it is. It's being used in some way of a museum to show how we can make mistakes for whatever reason, and then the mistakes are there. It would be a mistake to destroy the plant and vaporize it. I mean, it's there. The plant is complete, fully operational plant. It's just that they're not operating it. Okay? So with that, I am going to finish it. I'm going to finish here, and I'm going to tell you at this point that we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the rest of the stuff, okay, I am not going to spend time on this, but I do want you, write it down. I do want you to read 7 and 8. You can skip 9 because 9 is specialized. 10 you can skip. 11, 12, 13 you can skip, although 11, 12, 13 are interesting, just fascinating from a standpoint of geology and stuff, but it's secondary for our point. 14 is good. When I come back, I'm going to start with 14. 15 is extra. You don't have to read it. And 16 extra related to 15. So again, I do repeat now. We got through 6. 7, 8, I'm going to skip. Totally not consider. 9, not consider. 10, not consider. 11, 12, and 13, not consider. 14, I'm going to talk about it briefly when I come back. And 15 and 16, not consider. So we're done. Now we can go, all of us can go on a holiday. So with that, I believe we finished at this point. Next week, we are starting with the subject of sustainability of irrigated agriculture, which, by the way, is related to salinity. So we're still talking about salinity, but now we're giving it a different focus. It's only 2 lectures. 2 lectures next week, okay? Thank you very much. I do appreciate your attention.